So I'm bringing it right down because I appreciate that not all of you in the room necessarily know as much about DAOs as everyone else. So what is a DAO? So apologies for people that know all about this. So a DAO, as it says, decentralized autonomous organization. And lots of different definitions. This is mine, which is an online native decentralized organization with self-enforcing rules governed by its members. Now, an organization. Well, this is where you start to get into some of the many problems with DAOs, is that it could be for a whole range of things: for-profit, not-for-profit, one-off project, could be a whole lot of DAOs working together, sub-DAOs, all sorts of things. Autonomous. And now this confuses some people because it doesn't mean DAOs thinking by themselves, and we've already seen throughout some of the presentations about humans. So it's actually humans making the decisions. Because if a DAO can make its own decisions, then really it's an AI DAO. And also, but with the autonomous thing, again, depending on the DAO, is that once a decision has been made, say there's been a successful vote, then often the action is carried out automatically. But again, it depends. So, now, what about decentralized and governance? Now, governance in DAOs is not the same as traditional organizations, because in traditional governance, governance is sort of up here, like a board or something, and the operational decision-making is done lower down. But with a DAOs combine both, so both the governance and the operational, normally. And then decentralized means lots and lots of different things in different areas. So, for example, if you have a government decentralizing decision-making, that'll devolve it down, but it's still to central entities. Whereas in DAOs, there's a perception by some. Whoops, I won't hit this. Sorry, it's not going to work. Okay, some people, they come to me and say, we want to set up a DAO, and what they think it means is that they, as the founders, come up with everything and then the community votes upon that. But that's not meant to be the whole thing. When I explain it to them, they go, oh, well, maybe we won't have it. Maybe baby steps, because it does mean sort of loss of control. Yeah, it's not meant, so it's meant to be, in theory, that proposals come from the token holders and other token holders vote upon the proposals. Okay, that's what's meant to happen. Sorry, this is not good. Now, another thing with DAOs, and hopefully people picked up that weren't sort of so familiar with DAOs at the beginning of the day, is that the magic thing with DAOs is you can stop people from breaking the rules and breaking the law, which you can't do in traditional organizations. So a DAO can only do something if rules allows it to do it. And that can be a problem when you haven't actually got those rules in place. So they're quite brittle in that sense. So for example, the DAO, the big hack, even though some tokens were taken, they couldn't actually be withdrawn for 28 days because the rules didn't allow for that. Now, so with most DAOs, people decide what they think would help the DAO, and then they make proposals to do that. So it's not the case like in a traditional organisation with them thinking this is what we need and putting out a tender, which other people respond to. So completely different in that sense. Now, the issue with that is there's likely to be a lot of proposals and a need for voting. We just spoke in the last session about delegating, because it's just too much for people to do that all the time. So they might delegate other people to make decisions on their behalf. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, if it is truly decentralized, this has already been spoken about before, if it's truly decentralized, then any token holder could make a proposal and any or all of the token holders could vote on that proposal. But the trouble is you could have hundreds or thousands of proposals coming through, and there's no vetting. So are they malicious or are they just useless? And so you don't know. And also just the token holders, most of the time, just don't have the knowledge or the time to actually vote. And we've seen this play out time and time again. In some votes early on, there were fewer than like 1% of the token holders actually voting. So what most DAOs are now doing is some form of centralization, some form of vetting of proposals, or costs to putting them forward. So a bit like a filter, because it's going to cost you to do it. There can be vetting of the proposals, and they could be centralized or decentralized. You could have a council or a committee, and some people say, well, how on earth could you have that? That's centralized. But, well, do you want these things to work or not? Now, DAOs are a really good example of this quote. It's not from me. But, the real problem of humanity is the following. We have palaeolithic emotions. Some people don't think they do, but you do. Medieval institutions, so our institutions are clunky, and godlike technology. So early on with DAOs, they thought, wow, we've got this godlike technology, but they sort of forgot about the messy humans. And now we're realizing that. So this is what we've been talking about for the past 3 days, is how to govern these things. How do we get people to make better decisions? So, very quickly, DAOs and their governance exist along a continuum, which we've already seen today. So there's decentralized and centralized. And it's rare, very rare for a DAO to be on the left-hand side because of all the problems that it's caused. So the skill is, where do you strike the balance? And that's part of what we've been discussing. So that's the end of my talk. It was just, as I said, it was very simplistic for people who've been well versed in this, but hopefully, if you weren't too sure on DAOs when you walked in the door, that will hopefully set a bit of a scene.
Well, that was a perfect introduction to this session. Thank you, Alex. And next we have Jamilya Kamalova. I don't know if I've said your name. I've realized I've never actually said your surname out loud. Who is a PhD student at the University of Paris, working in Primavera's group that I mentioned before, Blockchain Gov. And she's also part of Kleros. So this talk is on dispute resolution.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ali, for introduction. So today, since my research is focusing on decentralized dispute resolution mechanisms, today I would want to talk about distributed ledger technology and distributive justice. So, sorry. Doesn't seem to work. Okay, I'll just start by saying that whenever I'm doing my research, and as a researcher, we're trying to define things, we're trying to find answers. So I'll start with just introducing the way I would try to define distributed ledger technology. And it could be described as a technological solution that allows storing information in decentralized way across different validators, eliminating the need for central authority. And then blockchain-based dispute resolution, something that we are talking very often, it's a type of alternative non-state dispute resolution method that utilizes blockchain technology and smart contracts as self-executing tool at some stage of the dispute resolution process. Then I would go further and outline shelling point type of blockchain dispute resolution as a subtype of blockchain-based dispute resolutions. And that would refer to the concept coined by Thomas Schelling that provides that people tend to choose focal point as a default in the absence of other means of communication. And when we talk about Schelling point, focal point in the discourse of dispute resolution, that would refer to decision-making processes when actors rely on game theoretic economic incentives while rendering their verdict. So that might bring you to the question, how blockchain-based dispute resolutions are different from existing variety of tools of alternative dispute resolution methods that we currently have. So I would start with pointing out that when it comes to decentralized, and by decentralized I mean blockchain-based dispute resolution methods, there's no single point of failure. And that pertains to the circumstances when appointment of the decision-making process, and the execution of the verdict is not subject to centralized vendor attack. Then we have transparency, of course, and that refers to inherent features of, I'll put a disclaimer, public blockchains that enable all the changes visible to all the parties. Then stemming from there, we have unchangeable records that allow applications and users to operate with a good degree of confidence. And some may call it censorship resistant. And then there are all other additional advantages that are being brought in space. Some might say, well, pseudonymous participation could also be seen as one of the tools that preserve privacy. However, I would say that it is a debatable claim, and especially when it comes to public blockchains. So since I'm researcher Claris, and Claris is one of the earliest decentralized dispute resolution platforms, that I would just want to outline that it's an example of Schelling point blockchain-based dispute resolution mechanism that enables decentralization of the processes at all stages of dispute resolution, namely crowdsourcing, pool of jurors, decision-making processes, execution of the verdict, etc. So I'm not going to go into detail what Claris says or how does it work. If you have time, you can always check it out. Please do. You're very welcome. Ask me any questions after that. But the important point is that Claris relies on game theory and economic incentives. And that's something that is being brought up very often as a criticism of those systems. That brings us to the question, is Schelling point type blockchain dispute resolution fair? And can actors, and in case of Claris, a pool of jurors led by economic incentives without relying on any, let's say, universal conceptions of fairness, still provide just outcome? So that brings us to the notion of fairness. How do we define it? And I would like to start with saying that there's no universal definition that everyone in the room would agree. But however, for the purposes of this research, I've taken justice as a fairness principle outlined by John Rawls, in my opinion, the most influential legal theorist. And Rawls, in his work, Theory of Justice, when describing a well-ordered society, notes that the public conception of justice is when everyone accepts and knows that everyone else accepts the same. So he outlines two of the principles of justice as fairness concept. And in my research, I would like to focus specifically on the second principle, on fair equality of opportunity. So whenever we talk, when we zoom out and talk about fair equality of opportunity, what do we mean? Well, generally, I would say that we mean that any actor, regardless of his background or prior experience, would have an equal access to public and social goods. Well, when it's applied to dispute resolution mechanisms, it becomes even more important given the situation and the problem of access to justice that we are facing in real world. So going back to the advantages that blockchain dispute resolution may provide, I suggest the hypothesis in my research paper that perhaps blockchain-based dispute resolution systems may be seen as facilitation of that second principle in the ideal idea described by John Rawls of justice as fairness concept. And I would like to focus here a bit more, and I would like to mention that in addition to advantages that we could see as an enhancement of the available alternative dispute resolution tools, I would outline, first of all, voluntary participation when it comes to actors to utilize this additional tool that exists. Then lack of centralized authority is something that has been brought at the start of my presentation, and that can be seen as something that associates with elimination of bribery and attacks. automated self-execution and decentralization of all the processes, as well as economic incentives, because sometimes they are being brought up as a criticism, but it also could be seen as something that eliminates a so-called lazy juror participation. But most importantly, I would say that having this additional option to settle disputes differently, or just settle disputes in general terms, that should be seen as a public good itself. Because when we refer to blockchain-based dispute resolution systems, we often refer to situations when actors just do not have ability or do not want to utilize centralized decision-making mechanisms. So I would want to also make a disclaimer that I have like a broader question that I'm posing in my research that I don't have an answer yet. What is the optimal type of blockchain-based dispute resolution that would fit the majority's understanding of fairness? And for now, my hypothesis is that while blockchain-based dispute resolution methods should not be seen as a blanket solution that would just solve universal problems of access to justice, however, it could be seen as something that furthers and develops the principles of fair equality and opportunity as defined by rules. And that point could also bring us to the discussion whether decentralized or crowdsourced dispute resolution methods actually facilitate more democratic participation. And my main argument is that we should not ignore this type of dispute resolution and perhaps maybe focus on different aspects of it so that we can work out what is the optimal way, what are the problems, how can we solve them. And on a general terms, as I said, I think having additional way of settling disputes for the parties that are seeking such dispute resolution, as well as jurors in case of clerics that decide to engage, I think in itself, having this additional opportunity should be seen as public good. Thank you so much.
Tara Merck is also a PhD student in the same research group at the University of Paris, and I've had the pleasure of co-supervising her. So come on down.
Thanks, Ellie, for co-supervising and also putting this on and inviting me. I did bring some slides, which I would love to magically throw in here. If not, then I'm just going to start without them. So my talk is concerned, or the title is DAOification as Exit to Community, which means, again, we're going to dive into definitions. I'm back. Definitions. Definition number one being DAOification. So there's this one mystical process. Alex has already tried to uncover some of its dynamics. And the question of how does this process lead to this other outcome, which is exit to community. DAOification, and here it would be really useful to have these slides. Otherwise, I will. Okay. I tried. No, I hope we can find them. Okay, so I'm going to change the format of slides, and maybe Theo wants to. Okay, we seem to have technical issues at a tech conference. I'm staying. Ah, there we go. Amazing, thank you. So thanks for bearing with me. DAOification as exit to community. The first part of this, as I was saying, is thinking about the process of DAOification. What is it? And then the second outcome of this presentation should be understanding the requirements that DAOification needs to meet in order to lead to an exit to community, and also what the unique opportunities and challenges are for using DAOification to accomplish an exit to community. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to draw on a pretty flexible definition come up by Primavera and Samir Hassan, where DAOs across academic literature today, or DAOification, is a process that enables people to self-govern online, ideally without centralized control, by using smart contracts deployed on a public blockchain, which autonomously enforces the rules for interaction amongst these people. So this is a pretty broad definition, but let's go into the other part of the question statement, which is what is exit to community, to draw some requirements to make this, this process more distinct. So what is E2C? It is definitely not being bought up by a bigger company, such was the case with Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook. It is also not the act of IPOing, which is something that, for example, Uber and many other companies have done, so going public. And it is definitely not having Elon Musk buy your startup. Exit to community is, however, concerned with startups and exit strategies. Here's a definition that I came up with. Exit to community is an emerging alternative exit strategy for startups, aiming to transition these projects towards more cooperative ownership and control. Why is exit to community something interesting, something that we should care about and people came up with? I should say here that the history of exit to community, it's a term coined by Nathan Schneider a few years ago. I think in 2019 was the first little blog written about it. It came against the backdrop of what we call the crisis of accountability in the digital platform economy. So seeing the political scandals that evolved around Facebook, having many people, an outcry over data harvesting strategies and monetization, the fact that governments are not able to globally regulate these platforms in a substantial way, and the question, what can we do to help? So accountability plays a big role, and the idea is that if we can transition such digital platforms into community ownership and control, then maybe by having more democratic governance from within will enable the kind of accountability that so far we have not been able to achieve. So that's one goal. A second goal of exit to community is that this strategy is closely aligned with another movement called platform cooperativism, which among other things is very much concerned with creating more equitable labor conditions, particularly in the gig economy, so what formerly may have seemed like the sharing economy, that is Uber drivers, Upwork people, and so forth. A third reason for exit to community and why we need it is kind of that it speaks to a general sense of unfairness and not being included in places where actually we, the consumers or prosumers or whatever you want to call it, are producing the value on these platforms. Well, why don't we get a share in that monetization or a say about how this data is governed? So drawing on this definition and some of the reasons for why exit to community is a very useful thing to aspire to, let's start deducing some of the requirements of then what does DAOification need to do to lead to exit to community. The first one is DAOification, when done to lead to exit to community, needs to actually lead to an exit. I have a definition here from the academic literature of what exit, especially entrepreneurial startup exit, means. It is the process whereby founders, entrepreneurs, and or investors in privately held firms remove themselves from the primary ownership and decision-making of that firm. What does that mean for DAOs? Put quite bluntly, it means that dropping the majority of your governance tokens to early teams and investors is not actually going to make it qualify as an E2C. The second point, or the second requirement, community. You actually need a community to be able to have a DAOification as an exit to community. Community in this, in my understanding, or what I'm drawing on, is Moorshed and Nathan Schneider's paper, who define a community being made up of the people who either contribute labor in the broader sense, so that's also posting on Instagram, to that sort of platform business, and also that these members who are contributing some sort of activity to the project start feeling a sense of belonging and relations between each other. So again, what does that mean in the DAO context? You need to actually have a community, which means that if you're just a service provider and you have customers, that may not qualify. Like, I'm a customer of a bank, but I don't really feel a sense of belonging there to the other customers of that bank. The third big requirement that I want to touch on is that an exit to community and its outcome should ideally lead to cooperative ownership and control. I've put up here, so cooperatives are a thing, and they have quite well-established structures, and they have a definition put forward here by the International Cooperative Alliance. So in that definition, which is one part that is important, that if you define your organization as such, you also commit to living by what we call cooperative values and principles, and these principles are quite defined. So another requirement for DAOification to qualify for exit to community is that that DAO in its day-to-day operations and governance orients itself according to these principles, some of which are notables is democratic member control of the organization is one of the principles. Another principle is that the members of a cooperative have economic participation in the matter. And a third really interesting principle is one around autonomy and independence, which is to say that if at a later stage you do want to bring in investors again or external stakeholders, you should always be ensuring that, you know, your DAO or cooperative DAO or exit to community thing does remain autonomous and independent from these outside influences. So these are three high-level requirements that DAOs need to take into account when they are DAOifying if they want to achieve an exit to community for all the great things I've mentioned. Why is it interesting to think about using a DAO to achieve this? I see a lot of opportunities, actually, in this vehicle. One of them is that in the traditional startup economy, actually, the normal exits, such as being bought up by a bigger investor or going public, are still really entrenched goals in that space. Whereas DAOs are from this crypto native space where magically this goal has disappeared, and decentralizing does seem to be an aspiration that many have. So just this big cultural norm from the space that DAOs are in is pretty significant and a big driver for using DAOification towards exit to community in the future. And something that I think is sometimes taken for granted or overlooked. A second big point is that tokens and smart contracts, I should add, are actually a brilliant new tool that we have invented that can help us to enable genuine community ownership and governance if designed correctly. I will put as a qualification here, but they are this great new thing. Jason calls it the design economies, right? And we should use them and harness their power for this exit to community process. A third one, and this one cannot be understated, in Web3 and with DAOs, we actually have investors on our side. So when you're thinking about exit processes, it matters what the founders want to do, but it also matters what the investors in a company are interested in. In the traditional startup economy, a lot of investors are not interested in their portfolio companies transitioning into worker-led cooperatives or that sort of thing, just because usually that does not earn very high returns. In the Web3 economy, however, we have some very outspoken large investor groups who say, yes, please, progressive decentralization, we're all for it. I'm saying we should harness that moment and that sort of sentiment that we're perceiving from this particular stakeholder group. And now for my last slide, and I don't want to stop on a negative note because challenges are really opportunities in disguise, as they say, especially for any researchers sitting here looking for new things to study in Web3. So the open problems maybe, or open questions then, for actually using DAOification as a means to exit to community. one thing that we don't really understand is what is democratic governance in a DAO, right? We've had like some notable examples in communities trying. We have proof of humanity, which is something that myself and Jamilya and some other colleagues are looking at. But what does that really look like? And how do we make democratic governance of a DAO ideally very successful, scalable, that sort of thing? We've heard from several people the question of membership, right? We need to understand who is this community and what is its different tiers and facets. We don't quite have that right yet. So the question of exit to community, who is it, who is members, and what are their rights and responsibilities? Third point, what does it mean to have equitable working conditions in the DAO? I know that Eli and some other people are looking at reward systems. We don't really understand what a member is. We don't understand really what a DAO worker is. We need to figure that out more to make it clear and actually achieve these goals of exit to community and the platform cooperative movement. And then last but very much not least, there's a lot of issues associated with legal liability and compliance, which we heard about a little bit more this morning from Stuart, and we're also discussing the past few days. So there's a lot of questions concerning the tokens, and are they equity, or are they not, and how to do that, how to wrap these new entities and cooperatives in a good manner. So with that, I want to leave you with a lot of things to work on and think about, and thank you very much.
And our final speaker in this short talk session before we move to Q&A is Theo Butel. I didn't say that right. He's going to say it right. Who is from SAFE, formerly known as NosaSafe, one of the key DAO infrastructures that I imagine almost every DAO in the Ethereum ecosystem uses. So he's here to tell us about that.
Okay, so hello everybody. The slides are working. My name is Theo. Butel, really doesn't matter. Theo is fine. And I'm glad to be here to talk a bit more from a practitioner's point of view with my experience at SAFE DAO as a DAO coordination lead. And previously I was working at Vita DAO, a decentralized science DAO, in a very similar role. Yeah, that is the whole presentation that you already saw. But let's start at the beginning. For context, SAFE originated from Gnosis. They built prediction markets, and for their ICO, they needed a multisig. So they built what was known as Gnosis Safe back then. This evolved into their main product. Gnosis Safe spun out as SAFE as a company. And more recently this year, the SAFE, the company, launched a DAO. And when I say they launched a DAO, that is really just a governance token, a snapshot space to have proposals, but not much more. So to go more into my experience over the last months at SAFE DAO and previously at Vita DAO, I'll just give you a few examples that I find relevant in relation to previous talks as well. So I'm just going to draw on this really good cover from The Economist, which also Jason Potts happened to use yesterday, which is really labeling as blockchain as the trust machine. And similar quotes also go along similar lines, and that really implies it is a machine. It's automated trust that is digitized, and of course you can use smart contracts for governance, and there is no need for this imperfect humans, and code is transparent, automated, and immutable. And this is a quote from my research as part of my master's thesis from a blockchain developer saying decision-making involves human factors that hopefully we can get rid of with blockchain governance. And you can debate whether that is true or not, but that also really just shows the intent behind, I believe, a lot of people working in the blockchain space have, and the way they look at things. So the reality, I believe, is quite different. Two examples, a very recent one, the FTX debacle with a centralized exchange effectively rugging their customers, stealing funds, doing the opposite of good governance, and really putting crypto in a very bad light. But to be clear, this is centralized finance and not what we know as decentralized finance or DeFi. Now, DeFi, the idea is, cannot be evil, as opposed to Web2 or centralized finance, where you would say, don't be evil. Decentralized finance just cannot. But there are other risks, like smart contract security risk, and this is an example from the DAO that was mentioned earlier by Alex Sims, where there was a hack that was not expected and also led in a huge loss of funds, or in that case, a fork. So here are just a few perspectives where I believe the promise of the trust machine falls short. So first, soft governance. As mentioned earlier, there's this idea of the smart contract for governance, which is beautiful if you believe that trust can be digitized and automized. In reality, DAOs always involve humans, at least the ones I've worked at, and there is always some sort of so-called soft governance process. So as opposed to on-chain governance, there's this off-chain component, be that discussing in a forum, having a call, having informal conversations, just really any part of the decision-making process leading up to the on-chain vote. And that is certainly true for almost all DAOs. Maintenance, another part where Web3 projects sometimes believe they do not need governance and they will remain immutable forever as they are. Now, you may not want to upgrade, like Bitcoin perhaps, but probably you should be able to respond to attacks, to fix bugs. And if that is something you will still keep doing, you will have governance inevitably. And lastly, something I'll go more into, and what Tara has already touched on, is the timeline or the launch process. And the perspective I would like to give here is that smart contracts are not deployed out of thin air. There's probably someone behind it. And Bitcoin is an interesting example where this individual or group of Satoshi Nakamoto obviously focused a lot to keep that decentralized or keep it a mystery who that actually is, and appears to be hands-off since then. But in most DAOs, there's a core team launching a DAO, there's someone defining parameters, there's someone choosing tooling, and all that, you could argue, must be included when you aspire to be decentralized. So that means if you acknowledge that every Web3 project has some sort of governance, and if you also acknowledge that properly they all have also some sort of soft governance, then how do you keep that decentralized? And here are just a few perspectives I find interesting from a practitioner's point of view that may relate to topics you're interested in. And first would be really to align, to identify the type of the DAO and align on a purpose, because surely there's no one-size-fits-all solution for DAOs, and we are just scratching the surface of these archetypes. And there's an interesting paper recently published by a Munich researcher, and that is, the list below is not exactly his clustering, which I can recommend to read, but I would summarize it as really protocol DAOs, where you probably would want to prioritize robustness over everything else. And then you've got product DAOs, they may be on top of a protocol, and that is a very good example in our case with SAFE, where practically speaking, SAFE has been worked on through a team for a long time. And the question is, to what extent to decentralize the product here? Do you replace the team with a DAO? Do you have a DAO that is complementary to your team? What is the purpose really of the DAO here? And that's just one example out of many, but oftentimes people have a simplistic or singular idea of what a DAO is, which I believe is not the case. And investment DAOs and social club DAOs are just really very different examples again, of course. Yeah, and then if you look at Vitalik Buderin's recent blog post, he suggests a really helpful framework, whether you should prioritize efficiency, robustness, or interoperability. And something I really like to think of here is to put that in layers and combine that with the idea of having a main DAO alongside sub-DAOs or pods, where, for example, the main DAO prioritizes robustness above everything because blockchain protocols probably stand out as opposed to Web2 due to characteristics like immutability. So robustness could be your top priority in your main DAO, but then sub-DAOs may want to be more efficient, may want to have more creativity, may want to have custom user interfaces that are not as rigorous and robust as your main DAO. And then, of course, you need to identify your stakeholders. And that is probably one of the first questions you should ask. And just to give it a practical example, SAFE, starting out as a multi-sig, evolved into a protocol used by many, many different organizations. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see there's a protocol, there's infrastructure, and there are interfaces. And that is just one dimension where you can differentiate these layers across the stack and think about what is sort of, where is robustness a priority and where other factors are priority. And wrapping up, here is just another really important perspective when you think about initiating a DAO, which is the distribution of voting power. And that, of course, is also being decided by someone at some point. And the default seems to be token-weighted voting, which you could probably describe as a plutocracy when you can really just buy votes. And that is the default. And I would argue it is the worst out of many, if not all, options, but it's really the most practical. It's Sybil resistant. And other solutions like meritocracy, where you approximate reputation, but then how do you do it accurately? It's just really hard. And democracy, something like Proof of Humanity does with trying to do one person, one vote without KYC. We're making progress here, but it's just not as widely used as token-weighted voting. And just another example from SAFE, by far we have figured that all out, but the Guardians program is one example, approximating reputation, if you will, because this is a set of delegates who received a relatively high airdrop of governance tokens due to their previous contributions to the SAFE protocol. They have proven their expertise, they have proven to be interested to be working on the protocol, and they appear to be aligned in terms of their vision. They're highly engaged, and all of that speaks in some way to their reputation, which is why in this case they received quite a bit more of governance voting rights than the average recipient as a user. Yeah, so I mean, I'm really ending here this talk with these insights into practice and probably more questions than answers. And something I would really like to just stress here is that researchers are often quite aware of their limitations and open research questions, whereas practitioners probably tend to be more confident about their practice. And I really like to believe that we have only best guesses and not best practices in blockchain and DAO governance in particular. And there's just much, much more need for collaboration between practice and research and creating feedback loops here, making sure practitioners listen to researchers and vice versa. And today, in the last few days, we're a fantastic step towards that. So I'm really happy to be here and would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay, we've got time for a couple of questions, quick questions for this panel. I know there was an awful lot in it, but definitely want to give people an opportunity to dig into some of that.
Yes. Question.
Yeah, please.
About the particular slide on human decision making on human factors. And what can you get a bit more in detail about the conversation you had with blockchain developer, because it'll help us evaluate what the technical developers or the full stack developers think about blockchain development ahead. Thank you.
Sure.
That should work.
Should work, yeah. So thank you for your question. I mean, it's hard to remember. That was actually 6 years ago. But FB had similar experience ever since. And I believe the motivation behind that statement is sort of a solutionist thinking among technical experts to believe and maybe want to believe that the technology solution is the solution here and the only thing you need to take into consideration. I understand that that seems to be like a beautiful thought and appear to be desirable. And I wonder whether that is often accompanied with enough reality checks and whether user research sometimes in a product sense is based on like, an opinion, and it should be kept neutral, of course. So I just believe that this is a widespread opinion that people just want to believe is true.
Further questions from the audience? Yeah, Jonathan.
Thank you. A lot of the work here was on the obviously governance focus and looking at the justice side as well. In the context of this community, but then engaging with external stakeholders, how transparent or how realistic is it that we actually have governance that they can engage with, particularly the external stakeholders who may not understand code or may not understand the technology? And then a secondary question that builds on that, probably more for in the justice space, the idea of access to justice is a major factor that a lot of the idea of not having CFI is built around not having certain large players control everything. How can we ensure that we try and drive for the aspiration of more access to justice in the context of DeFi when people can't necessarily understand the code in the first place or can't easily engage with it?
Good questions.
I'll just jump in. I think it's like buyer beware. There's a DAO. If you want to engage with the DAO, that's the way it is. But also just on access to justice, these Kleros and other ones are actually helping access to justice, because access to justice, we don't have much access to justice at all. So this is actually a way of furthering it. But,
yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think it's there's no one answer to that. I myself argue that, well, whenever we speak about blockchain-based dispute resolution systems, and sometimes we see in the papers and just blog posts that people refer to it as like universal solution, as I was mentioning in my research. But then we are also talking about maybe it being used in countries that do not have like, viable traditional judicial system in place. But then we are saying, but wait, not all people even have internet access, let alone, are able to use like cryptocurrency or know how to open like crypto wallet and etc. So that's why like I put a disclaimer and said, hey, that's not just universal blanket solution. It is like additional option, like a supplement. And then on a more practical terms, it's just an open question really. But I think what projects are trying to do, at least what I've observed in the space, they're trying to create the interface or work towards being like beginner friendly, so that it will be intuitively clear for users, so they don't have to necessarily being able to read the code or even understand all of the technicalities of the technology they're working with, or whether they would be able to navigate and utilize it for their own benefit.
Maybe I can just add also, like following up from that, you don't have to understand you don't understand how the car works to drive the car sort of argument to an extent, but thinking about, in my context, like DAOs, and what happens if DAOs are implemented in communities where not everybody is very tech savvy or even interested in blockchains and tokens. I'm doing some research with Data, which is an art collective, who are trying to create a DAO, and there's lots of artists also from very diverse contexts and backgrounds with different languages who participate in this project. And many of these artists, for example, are not interested in understanding tokens and blockchains necessarily, or that's not their driving reason. So I agree here with what Jamilya said, that there is a lot of education also that maybe needs to happen on the one hand. There's, on the other hand, something around like user interfaces and UX. So using technology to make technology easier. On the education side, I'm also thinking we do have little modules on how our governments run in various countries in high school, and that gives us a starting point to explore more if we want to. So having more of that thinking from an early stage. And then lastly, to say that it is maybe still a preferable option to be able to have a space where you voice, I don't understand this, can you please make this better? Rather than having these closed off, centralized sort of ecosystems where there's not even the opportunity to voice that user feedback as not just a user, but a co-governing member with some sort of rights. So to have these channels open, I think, is important.
I'm going to go down here because you already asked a question. So last question for this panel here.
So my question is in regards to how does DAOs are usually run by communities. How is it sustained, like from a monetary perspective?
Good question. Theo, I reckon this is one for Theo.
How are DAOs sustained from a
management perspective?
It's a really interesting question. And when you think of DAOs as communities, that sometimes leads to like phenomena where they still fall back on very centralized structures just to operate efficiently. Like, for example, the investment DAO example I was touching on earlier, you could make a good argument that maybe you want to have a diverse community to have the ultimate decision, but you probably have a centralized group of experts where there are barriers to entry based on expertise that make a decision which proposals to even consider. So the management part in DAOs is, I think, something that is very relevant, and I also see often that DAOs try to believe they need to be decentralized in everything, like every single thing they do, and also that current best practices would not apply to them, whereas you could probably make a good argument in many cases that the decentralization aspect is relevant to some parts, whereas other parts of their community, like an operations department, like a finance department, like a HR department, if you will, should probably fall back on existing management best practices and have that embedded in a decentralized governance framework. So that's one concept I would like to push.